Hello, everyone. As you gather with us, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Receive whatever greeting is appropriate to your particular space time. Um, it's a pleasure to have you all here at the IIP once again for another IIP talk. I think we've seen many of you at this series on other occasions, and it's wonderful to be with you again for today's event with the wonderful Fabrice Bourlez, who will be addressing us very soon as we continue to work on the question of challenges for contemporary psychoanalysis. We have just a couple of brief announcements before we begin. I want to make sure right off the bat everybody is comfortable finding their way to the interpretation function. Is that in the chat? I want to make sure of that for everyone. For those who can hear me, uh, I'm letting you know that at the bottom of the screen, your Zoom platform here, there's a little globe which you can select to choose the language in which you'd like to listen. Before we go any further, as is our policy of hospitality here at the IIP, I will give a brief audio description of myself for anyone who may be viewing this video who has a visual impairment. So I'm a white cis man with brown hair and a beard and clear glasses. I'm here in my home, and behind me there are two windows and uh, a quite drab looking orange chair. Um, and hopefully that'll suffice. Uh, Again, we're going to be hearing from Fabrice in a moment, but just a couple of announcements. This is not the last of our IIP talks. We have yet another coming up next week, I believe, with Tatiana Gomez, who will be um, addressing us in Portuguese only. That for that event, we don't have the live translation, but for those Lusophones who may want to continue this journey with us, please once again join us for Tatiana next week. Again, like all the other events, it is free and open to everyone. Also, we have a continuation of our Ateliers series, which we began, I think, in the summer, it seems, and which has been a really rich set of discussions about all kinds of things. We've covered the waterfront conceptually. And Jacques Conceição will be joining us on the 10th and the 24th of this month. Those are both Wednesdays to make what I'm sure will be a very rich intervention in her way. So those are the announcements I have at the moment, but I'm gonna, before we introduce our speaker, I'm gonna hand it off to Dorothée, who's going to give us a little more information about the goings on at the IIP. So Dorothée, the floor is yours.
Olá a todos, todas e todes, bem-vindos.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Não me conheço, me chamo
For those who do not know me already, I am Dorothée. I work as an executive coordinator at the IIP. Welcome, everybody who are here for the first time. I'm not going to talk a lot, just a little bit to announce the formations that we are offering and that are going to start already now in September. So I'm going to present myself. I am a white woman. My hair is tied back. Today, I'm wearing a headphone, glasses, wearing hoop earrings. I'm going to share my screen now briefly to present to you the two formations that we are offering this year at the IIP. We have two formations. They're 100% online and they last 1 year. And I'm showing you my screen in Portuguese. Maybe I'll show you the screen in English and I'll speak in Portuguese and everybody will understand me because we also have the translators. So the first formation is about the foundations for contemporary psychoanalysis. As I said, it's all online from September to August of next year. We have a very complete program. This program is open to anybody who is interested in psychoanalysis, for anyone who's curious about it, who wants to know more, or for those who already have a long trajectory in the clinic. So it's open to anyone. And this formation counts on teachers from all over the world and also students from all over the world. So it's very enriching, this multiculturality that we provide and the people who participate provide. Today, we have the luck to have Fabrice Bourlez, who is also a very important professor in this formation. We're very happy to have him here and very proud of this. He provides a class, he teaches a class called The History of Psychoanalysis, which are recorded classes. And then the classes are recorded, and then we have live classes where we discuss what was talked about in the class. We have the 4 fundamental concepts by Monica Godoy. We have classes by Freud from his text, by Jérôme Courtois and Lodi Lofer, and the 21st seminars of Lacan. So the classes are recorded, and then we have live classes to discuss what was talked about by the director of the IIP, Benoît Le Boutelier. And we have new classes that are going to be part of this formation. We have a class by Jalil Benani, which is Decentering Psychoanalysis, and Jacques Conceição, a class about race, gender, and class. And a class that I don't have a lot of class about, but if Fabrice wants to talk about it, is the post-human jouissance. Sorry, I exited the screen accidentally. So I think I'm at the end of this program, which is packed full. We also have classes about psychic structures. Every month we have a professor who will talk to us about their own clinical work and the construction of clinical cases. So you can see the great number of professors that we have that will talk about their clinical practice. And every month or 2 months, we will have a specific time where we have a time for listening, where you can go more in depth in questions that you have along the course of the classes, and the class gets to know each other better. So this is what we offer. Carol will put all this information in the chat about this formation. You will have a link to access this page with information about the value of the classes, the price, the duration, etc. We have testimonies of former students too. So now I'm going to talk about the second formation. Benoit, could you tell me if you can see the pink screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Can somebody tell me? Yes, thank you.
Então, essa formação está mais direcionada para pessoas que já
So
têm uma
this formation
prática
is directed at people who already have clinical
a
practice,
gente chama
ongoing
ela
clinical
de
practice. We
técnicas para
call it
uma clínica
techniques
contemporânea.
for a contemporary clinic.
Pronto. Essa formação tem o mesmo formato online.
The formation is the same format. It's online. It's translated into French, Portuguese, English, and if necessary, Brazilian Sign Language. The difference is that all the classes are live. We don't have recorded classes. In the other formation, we also have a lot of live classes. So we have supervision groups.
No qual a gente vai trabalhar, tem um
And
espaço
we
de supervisão.
have once a month we have supervision. We have research work once a month too with a professor who is going to develop his personal research in the work, and it's also a smaller group than a class that I love the title of, but I have it in English, but it's called Lacan, Back to the Future, Implications for a Topological Paradigm, which will be taught by Jed Wilson, who is here with us today. He will be the mediator. Marta Marciano and Monica Godoy, who will put their clinic in parallel with topology. And with the other course, we have the construction of clinical cases. And with Jed Wilson, we will have a class about psychoanalytic technique. So every class, every month, we have very specific topics about technique. In this formation, we will see the later writings of Benoit from seminar 20 onward. So that's it for this formation. Do not hesitate. We are we have registrations are extended to Monday, so we're going to have a little bit of more flexibility for people who are here and want to register. We're going to give you a bit more time to register if you would like to. So I hope you have a great conference today with Fabrice. Fabrice, I'm going to propose to you that you present yourself, introduce yourself for those who do not know you, and you have the floor.
D'accord. Merci beaucoup, Dorothée. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais d'abord me
Thank you,
présenter
Dorothée. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to introduce myself. An audio description. I'm a white man. I have a mustache. I am wearing a blue shirt with a yellow scarf, and there's a bookshelf behind me. To introduce myself quickly, I am a psychoanalyst, Fabrice Bourlez. I've worked in mental health institutions for a long time. Today I work in my private practice. I am also a philosopher. I graduated in philosophy, and recently I published a book in the Presse Université de France. That's it for my first introduction. I like to tell you that it's with great joy that I come here today to discuss with you these topics, and I like to thank all those who make the IIP possible, and I also like to tell you of the pleasure that it is to accompany you since the beginning of this institute. I think it's been 4 or 5 years. We've known each other for a little while. And in this institute, I have found not only psychoanalysts, colleagues, or students who are absolutely formidable, who are passionate about the topics that we discuss.
je crois, je peux le dire aujourd'hui,
They
que le
help
temps a
me
passé
clarify
sur
my
les amitiés, en
thinking.
fait, hein. Des gens
But over
que
time,
j'ai
I have
plaisir à
also
retrouver
found friends.
régulièrement et des gens
I
avec
found
qui
people
j'ai
that I enjoy seeing
l'impression
again
de grandir.
and with whom
Et
we
donc,
grow together.
pour ça, je voudrais vraiment remercier toutes celles et tous ceux qui
So
œuvrent à rendre
I'd
possible les
really
gens de
like to
l'Institut, à
express my
savoir les traducteurs, les
sincere
traductrices,
gratitude to all
tout le
those who
staff
work to make the
qui
Institute's
chapeaute
work
l'organisation
possible, the
administrative, la
translators, the
communication, la
entire
coordination,
administrative
Dorothée en premier,
communications and
bien d'autres personnes
coordination
avec elle, et
team,
puis
the
il se
Hote
trouve que
above
l'amitié,
all, and
pour son
all
amitié,
the
pour
other
sa
people who work with
confiance,
her. I'd like to
qui
thank you
sont
for your
vraiment
friendship, for
des
your
témoignages qui me vont
trust,
toujours droit au cœur, c'est
and
évidemment Benoît.
they
Alors,
are,
je le répète souvent, mais
this is a
plus j'avance
testimony
avec
that comes
vous,
straight
chers
from my
amis,
heart. And of course, I
plus je trouve
cannot,
que c'est vrai.
I'd have to mention
Je trouve
Benoit.
qu'on a
And the
réussi
more
à mettre sur pied
I
un
advance with you
dispositif, un
in
institut
time, I realize
qui
that we
constitue
have
un espace et une
created an
temporalité
institute
qui est
that
très singulier, très
constitutes
original,
space
ou
and
plutôt je devrais dire très
temporality that is very
contemporain cette fois. Ce
singular,
dispositif
very
qu'on a mis sur pied,
original,
il est
very
contemporain,
contemporary. I
puisque comment
think
il
we can
marche,
say that it's
cet
an
institut
apparatus that
international
is very
psychanalytique?
contemporary.
C'est très simple. La plupart
Because
du temps,
how
il faut
does
bien
it
le
work,
dire,
right?
on
It's
est
very
tous et
simple.
toutes
Most of the
tout seuls
time,
derrière notre écran.
we are
Et
each one
on
of
est
us alone behind our
séparés
screens,
et on
right?
est chacun,
We are
chacune séparés
separated,
aux quatre coins du monde.
and at
Et
the same
pourtant,
time,
l'espace et le temps
we're
d'individualisme
separated
a
in the four
existé,
corners of the world, but
rien à faire, c'est la
yet
vérité.
in the
On
space and
arrive
time of the
à se
encounter,
sentir proche
and this is the
malgré
truth,
la distance,
we manage to feel
à moins
close
que ce soit le
despite the
contraire.
distance.
C'est-à-dire
Or
que
rather,
nous
we
arrivons
manage to
à
feel
nous sentir
sufficiently distant
suffisamment distants
to say things
pour
that are
parvenir
close
à
to
se
each
dire
other.
des choses qui ne se disent habituellement qu'entre proches. Il y a en tout cas une sorte de petit paradoxe comme ça dans
So
l'IP,
we
qui
are
fait qu'on est à
sufficiently
la
distanced to
fois
say things
liés les
that
uns
we can
aux
only
autres,
say among people
même
who
si
are
on est
close to
loin
each other. So this is the paradox of
géographiquement
the
les uns des
Institute,
autres.
where we are
Ou
connected to
bien
each
peut-être
other
l'inverse.
and yet we are far apart.
Peut-être que
Or maybe the
on est
other way
loin
around, I
les
don't
uns
know.
des autres et
Maybe
on
because we
arrive
are far
à se
apart,
sentir au cœur d'une
we
même
manage to
recherche,
feel
d'une
at the
même
heart
quête, parce
of
que
the
on
same
rassemble nos
research,
forces
the
des quatre coins
same
du monde.
quest,
En tout cas, c'est
because
assez
we
magique. Il y
join
a ce
forces from all
paradoxe
over
de
the
la
world.
proximité dans la
It's very
distance
magical,
qui
but there is
fonctionne.
this paradox
Et
of closeness and
ça
distance
fonctionne, ce
that
paradoxe,
works.
parce que le temps où
And this
on se
paradox
retrouve,
works
eh bien, j'ai vraiment
because
l'impression qu'on utilise
during
les
our meetings, I
technologies, les
have the
réseaux,
impression that
l'Internet,
we
de
use
manière
technologies, the network,
suffisamment
the internet
intense que pour sortir
in
du
a
scrolling généralisé,
sufficiently
pour sortir
intensive
d'une
way
sorte d'individualisme un peu plat,
to
un peu endormi,
exit an
d'une sorte
individualism
d'étonnement fasciné par
that's
ce que les réseaux
a bit
sociaux lui
hypnotic
proposent
by
habituellement, et
what
on
social
arrive
media propose
progressivement
to
à
us
constituer
habitually.
une
We are
véritable
able
communauté de
to
travail, une
progressively
communauté de travail
uh,
où, je dirais, on
constitute
se
a
sent bien.
working community, and that
Voilà.
makes us
En
feel alive.
réalité, avec mes quelques remerciements bien sentis
So,
là
in
et ces quelques
reality,
considérations
I
préliminaires, je voudrais
believe
déjà
that
un
with
petit peu
these
raconter
few
tout ce que je vais venir
preliminary
dire aujourd'hui. Donc,
considerations,
chers
I've
petits amis,
already
au revoir et à la
mentioned what
prochaine
I'm
fois.
going
Alors,
to
je vais
talk
continuer un
about
peu plus là quand
today.
même. Mais
So,
lorsque
all right, bye
Benoît m'a
bye. That's it.
demandé
No,
d'écouter
just
la
kidding.
question aujourd'hui
When
des
Benoit
défis
asked
de la
me to
psychanalyse
address
contemporaine,
today
je crois
regarding
que
the
les défis de la
challenges of
psychanalyse contemporaine, c'est
contemporary
vraiment la question qui est au cœur de
psychoanalysis,
l'unité. Et
I
pour
think
le
it's an
dire
issue
de
that
manière
is at the
très
core
rapide
of the
et
Institute.
globale, je pense que
And to
les
put it
enjeux,
very
les
quickly and
défis pour une
broadly, the
psychanalyse
challenges for
contemporaine, ça
contemporary
pourrait s'entendre à partir
psychoanalysis
d'une
can
simple
be
formule qu'on peut
understood in
entendre
two
de deux façons. Je
ways
vous donne la
based on a
formule,
simple formula.
elle est, elle est, elle
So
est,
I'm going to give you
elle est
the
très simple.
formula and
Et
you
je
tell
l'énonce
me.
comme ceci.
It's very
Comment
simple.
rester vivant et vivant?
This
Moi,
is
je
how
crois que
I
c'est vraiment
enunciate
l'enjeu
it.
pour la
How
psychanalyse
to
d'aujourd'hui.
stay alive.
Comment
How to
rester
stay alive.
vivant et vivant?
I think that's what
Je vous explique un peu
is
ce que
at
ça veut
play
dire,
in
comment rester
today's
vivant et vivant.
psychoanalysis. How to remain alive.
D'abord,
I'm
ça
going to
concerne
explain the double
surtout
meaning of
les
this phrase.
personnes
So
qui vivent au
first of
XXIe siècle.
all,
Comment faire
this
en sorte qu'au XXIe
concerns
siècle, on se sente
people living
vivant.
in the 21st
Mais je
century.
crois, et c'est le deuxième
How
sens que je voudrais
can
donner à
we
cette
feel
formule, que ça
alive in the
vaut
21st
aussi
century and stay
pour la
alive?
discipline
And the second meaning
médicale.
that I want to give applies to the discipline itself. How to stay alive, how does it keep psychoanalysis alive in the 21st century? In this moment of political, ecological, economic crises, how can we make it so that psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical practice stays alive in the 21st century? That is our challenge. How to stay alive and how to make alive those who participate in its adventure. I'm going to elaborate on this for a moment. The first way to understand this question that Benoit gave to me, of course, is to try to clarify what has always been at stake in psychoanalysis, its onset. We try to show how psychoanalysis helps to reawaken desire. And you might say to me, oh, but Fabrice, come on, with the global catastrophe we're going through with Trump, with global warming, what we're experiencing is so serious and unprecedented. How can psychoanalysis still help us? And yeah, you're right. The situation is quite serious. But I would also remind you that Freud lived through the First World War. He experienced the crisis of 1929 and the rise of fascism and Nazism. So it is in this context that he wrote his entire work. So we can say that Freud writes his work in a context that wasn't very funny or light, so it was also quite serious. So perhaps psychoanalysis can continue to make us feel alive despite everything. I want to believe in this hypothesis because despite the terrible circumstances he was going through, Freud was able to conceive of an incredible discipline. He was able to think about a practice that only comes about when it encounters the unexpected, when it is before surprise. So Freud said that the clinical encounter that happens in an institution or an office, it is an encounter with something that is unexpected. It is an encounter with something that awakens us, with what we didn't think we could say or think or tell ourselves or others. The clinical encounter is an encounter with the unexpected. And pay attention here. And this unexpectedness, it surprises both the analysand and the analyst. I would say even more that the surprise is shared. And sharing in French and in Portuguese is something that we have, and in English too, is something that we have in common, and also what divides us. So we can share a flat or public transportation, but no, in English it doesn't work out, sorry. But in French, sharing means what we have in common and what divides us. So you can share an apartment in French, and you can also share, be divided on an issue. So the surprise in psychoanalysis is always divided and shared. And I would also add that the unconscious, for better or for worse, is what dislodges us from our habits and
C'est ce qui
certainties.
interrompt le bon sens.
The unconscious
vient
is
faire
what
énigme.
interrupts
Ce qui
common
laisse
sense.
perplexe.
It's what creates an
C'est ce qui va
enigma. It's what
arrêter
leaves
le
us
développement
perplexed.
en ligne droite
It
de
is
la
what
pensée.
stops straight
qui va
line development,
interrompre
linear
la
progression of
progression
thought.
linéaire.
It interrupts this
L'inconscient,
linear
c'est
progression.
exactement
The unconscious
l'inverse
is
de ce
exactly
que
what
fait
causes
le
the
plan
plan
que le coach vous prescrit
that your
pour
coach
résoudre vos
has
problèmes.
prescribed to solve your problem.
L'inconscient,
And 2 shakes of a
c'est
lamb's tail,
exactement le
right?
contraire de je vais
Immediately.
résoudre vos problèmes
It's exactly
en
the
2 temps, en
opposite
mouvement.
of
Je vais vous aider à perdre du poids en 6 semaines.
it's
Stop
exactly
chrono.
the opposite.
Je vais
I'm
faire
going
en
to
sorte
help you
que vous allez
lose
réussir
weight in
à
6
avoir un sommeil
weeks or
parfait et
solve your
avec
problem
et
in
en
2
croissance.
weeks.
Eh bien,
I'm going to help you get a perfect night's sleep,
quand on se
quit
réfère à
smoking in 3
l'inconscient,
sessions.
on sait que ces
When we
promesses-là
refer to the
ne marchent pas.
unconscious, we know
Ou
that these
pire,
promises do
les
not work.
promesses des coachs qui
Or
disent en 2 temps sans
even
mouvement, vous
worse,
allez guérir.
the
Eh bien, une fois qu'on a
promises
perdu
that
50 kilos ou qu'on a
in
enfin
3,
rangé
4
sa maison,
sessions
on
you're
pourrait
going to be
arrêter
cured.
enfin se ranger des
Once we
ongles. Eh
lose
bien,
the
à la
weight
place
or we
d'être fier,
organize our
heureux,
house or we
content,
stop
satisfait,
biting our
accompli,
nails,
réalisé,
instead of being
quelque part, une fois
proud
que le
and
but est atteint,
accomplished,
on va se sentir
fulfilled,
un petit peu déprimé,
you're going
un
to,
petit peu triste,
once everything is
voire un
resolved,
petit
you're
peu
going to
énervé.
feel a little bit
C'est qu'en
depressed,
fait,
a little
le
sad,
coach nous
or even a
enseigne,
little nervous
l'analyste, le psychanalyste
or upset.
essaye
So
plutôt
the
de laisser
coach sells the
l'analysant
dream,
ou
and the
l'analysante
analyst
interpréter ses rêves. Et c'est
the makes
donc
the analyst
l'inconscient,
interpret his own
c'est ce
desires
qui refuse
and
à
dreams, and it's not the
rentrer dans
same
le
thing at
rang
all.
du bon sens.
So the unconscious is that
L'inconscient, pour le dire
which
simplement,
refuses to
pourrait
fall
dire que
into
c'est comme
line with
une
common
tache dans un
sense.
tableau, ou le flou
It's
dans une photo, ou la
it's like
rature
a
dans un
stain
texte.
on a painting,
Bref,
or it's the
l'inconscient,
blur in a
c'est l'écart,
photo,
c'est
or
le
it's something that's
dérapage,
scribbled on in
c'est
a
aussi
text. It's the
ce qui fait
deviation, it's the
sursauter
slip
et
up,
qui, en nous
but
faisant
it's
sursauter,
also
en
the
nous
jolt
surprenant,
that
va
opens
ouvrir
up a new
une brèche, une
perspective.
perspective nouvelle. Combien de fois j'entends mes analysants, mes analysantes me dire
So, how many times have my patients told me, oh, I know I already told you this, but I can't understand what it means. So they repeat what they've already told me until they manage to interpret it, and then they can decipher it, interpret it in a different way. So I think the work of psychoanalysis begins here at the point where we don't understand, when there's that which repeats itself and it starts when we're faced with a trial that we don't want to understand, that we can't face, with an event we can't accept, from an unbearable place. So the unconscious, the encounter with the unconscious comes from an unbearable place, the loss of a loved one, the impasse of a romantic relationship, repeated failure, an addiction we can't break free from. And most of the time, psychoanalysis begins because of something that seems quite unbearable. And since Freud, it's certain that psychoanalytics, talking and listening, help us to stay alive, to stay in life, going down the side of the discovery of our desire. In fact, psychoanalytic talking and listening, they help us to understand what we hold dear. And this that we hold dear, and in French, this expression means both holding, something holds me because I love him or her or it, and also that which holds me so that I can stand on my own 2 feet, so that I'm standing. So I believe that one of the challenges for psychoanalysis today is to continue to find ways to make us alive, to make us stay alive,
à nous faire saisir un peu plus précisément
by giving us a means to understand a little bit better the coordinates of our desire and our lives in order to accept, to cope with, to make peace with the unlivable, and sometimes also to perceive this unlivable in a completely unexpected way.
Aujourd'hui, je crois que ça nous permet d'apercevoir que cet
And
invivable
doing psychoanalysis today
peut être perçu
helps us
de
notice
manière
that the
inattendue.
unlivable
Tiens, je n'avais
can
jamais
be
entendu ce mot-là
perceived
comme ça.
in a
Tiens, je n'avais
surprising
jamais
way.
formulé ça
I had
comme
never
ça.
heard the word
Je
like that, for
pense
example.
à
Wow,
ça
I
en
had
vous le
never
disant.
said it
Je
like
dis
that.
ceci très très souvent,
Oh,
mes analysants et mes
I'm only
analysants.
thinking about this as I'm telling you. My patients often say to me from my
Faire la paix
analysans,
ou apercevoir autrement
and
l'invivable,
making peace with or
c'est parfois
perceiving the
aussi
unbearable
s'apercevoir
in a
que la
different
tache dans
way.
le tableau, le
We also
flou dans
have
la
to
photo,
perceive that the
c'est
stain,
pas
the little
forcément une
stain
erreur,
on the
c'est pas
painting or the
forcément un
blur in the
raté,
photo is not
mais c'est
necessarily a
justement
mistake or a
ce qui
failure,
permet au
but it's
tableau
precisely
de
that
valoir la peine
which
d'être
makes the
regardé.
painting
C'est parce
itself
qu'il y a la
worth
tache dans le
looking
tableau
at.
qu'on s'intéresse au
It's
tableau.
because there is the stain on
Alors,
the painting that we are
c'est parfois très
interested in
mystérieux
the
une
painting.
psychanalyse, hein. C'est pas toujours
So
dire
sometimes
mais
it's very
pourquoi,
mysterious.
comment, mais le
Psychoanalysis is
fait que
quite
quand on
mysterious.
arrive un tout petit peu à
We
mieux
don't know
faire
how
la
to say
paix avec
how or
la
why,
tache dans le
but
tableau,
we are
le flou
able
dans la
to
photo, avec
deal
l'invivable,
better with
eh
the
bien, quand
stain
on
on the
arrive à faire un
painting
tout
or
petit
the
peu plus
blur
les
in the
comptes avec
photo, the
l'invivable,
unbearable.
l'espoir
When we
renaît
are able
et
to
la
deal
force
with the
d'un
unbearable a little
désir
bit more,
vivant
hope is
vient
reborn and the
s'articuler
power of a
entre
living
nous.
desire is articulated between
Donc,
words.
continuer à trouver les moyens de nous rendre
So,
vivants,
continuing to find
vivantes,
ways to make
c'est une
ourselves
recherche
alive,
qui part aujourd'hui,
this
je
is a
dirais, dans trois
quest
directions
that
en même
goes
temps.
in at least three
On est au
directions
carrefour
at
d'une
once.
direction technique, d'une
So
direction
we have a
métapsychologique,
technical
et ce sera ma
direction,
conclusion
a
aujourd'hui,
metapsychological
d'une direction
direction,
politique.
which is
Alors, pour
my
être tout à fait
conclusion
clair,
today, and a
selon
political
moi,
direction.
technique,
And to
métapsychologie
be
et
perfectly
politique, je l'ai dit,
clear,
chaque fois que je
according
prends
to
la
what I
parole,
think,
constituent
technique,
les trois
metapsychology,
axes de
and
la clinique
politics, I
psychanalytique.
always say this, they
Technique,
constitute the three
métapsychologie et
axes of
politique, c'est la
psychoanalytic
nature de la
practice.
rencontre clinique.
Technique is
Et la technique, ça va être tout ce qui se
technique,
passe à l'intérieur.
metapsychology, and
Comment on échange la
politics is
parole,
the matter
comment on se
that
tait,
constitutes clinical
comment on gère
practice.
l'argent,
Technique
quels
is
gestes
everything
on
that
pose
happens in
le
the
cadre de la
session,
cure,
how
comment
speech,
tient le cadre de la
silence,
cure, quelle durée, quelle
money,
fréquence se met en
gestures
place
are
entre l'analyste et
exchanged,
l'analysant. La technique,
how
c'est
the
la manière
framework,
dont l'analyste et
duration, and
l'analysant
frequency
vont
are
arriver à se
established
situer
between
dans
the
la situation.
analyst and analysand.
Et cette
It is the
technique,
way in which
elle
the
est
analyst and
toujours
analysand
étroitement
position themselves
reliée
in the
au
relationship.
deuxième
And
axe
this
qui est l'axe
technique is
métapsychologique.
closely linked to the
Qu'est-ce que c'est la
second axis, which is
métapsychologie? Eh bien, ce sont
metapsychology.
tous les enjeux
In other
conceptuels,
words, it is
théoriques,
the
avec
conceptual
lesquels on
and
va
theoretical
réfléchir
issues
ce qui se
involved
passe
in reflecting on
chez
what
vous.
happens during a
Bon,
session.
c'est absolument rien de révolutionnaire de dire ça.
So there's
Hein,
nothing
c'est vraiment
revolutionary
très
about
spécifique
saying that,
de la
is there?
psychanalyse
It's
depuis Freud.
really
Ce qui se
quite
passe dans le
specific of
cabinet, ce qui a
psychoanalysis
lieu
since
dans le
Freud.
cadre de la
What
séance
happens in
vient
the
influencer
consulting
la
room
thérapie
influences
psychanalytique, la
theory,
métapsychologie.
and
Et la
theory
métapsychologie,
influences
en
what
conférence
happens in the
théorique,
session.
viennent influencer ce qui va se passer dans la séance. Il y a une sorte de drôle d'aller-retour entre théorie
So
et pratique.
there's a kind of back and forth between theory and practice, which is quite interesting. And in fact, for Freud, clinical knowledge must be deduced from each case. In psychoanalysis, there is no universal, there is no general truth in psychoanalysis. So there's no system in psychoanalysis. The specificity of psychoanalytic knowledge is that it is deduced from the experience of what happens in treatment. So that is why we can say that psychoanalysis is the opposite of philosophy. Philosophy is the search for truth that applies to anyone. Psychoanalysis, on the contrary, is the place where the universal concept fails, like a boat running aground on the sand. In psychoanalysis, the concept fails in the reality of each case.
Alors, comment la pratique psychanalytique peut-elle,
So how
à l'heure
does
actuelle,
psychoanalytic
contribuer à nous
practice
rendre
today
vivants et vivantes?
contribute
Ben,
to
relever
making
le
us
défi d'une
stay
psychanalyse
alive today
contemporaine, c'est montrer comment cette pratique
by
est en
identify
mesure de
the
modifier
challenge of
les
contemporary
effets des
psychoanalysis
succès d'aujourd'hui.
means showing
Et
how
concrètement, ça
how
pourra
this
se
practice is
traduire
still capable in
trouver
invigorating the
des
desire of
manières
today's
inédites
subjects.
d'interpréter.
Concretely,
Ça, pour moi, c'est
I
vraiment un
believe this
point
means finding
qui se
new ways
situe
of
à la
interpreting.
croisée
And for me,
de la
this is really the
métapsychologie et de la
question that
technique
lies between
psychanalytique.
metapsychology
Et
and
c'est la
technique.
question la plus
And it
fondamentale,
is
et
both the
c'est
most
qui me semble la plus compliquée et la plus
interesting and
intéressante, et
the
c'est
most
celle que je mets
complex
au
question.
travail à peu près dans tous mes cours à l'IIP.
It is the one I
Comment
work
est-ce qu'on
on in
interprète?
almost all my
Comment
classes
on
at the
fait
IIP.
pour
How
interpréter
do we
un sujet
interpret?
quand on est dans la position de jouer
How
pour
do
ce
we
sujet
interpret
le
a
rôle de
subject
l'analyste?
when we are in the
Alors évidemment,
position
il y a une réponse qui est
of
banale et basique à cette question.
analyst?
C'est
Of
on
course, there's an
interprète
obvious
au cas
answer
par
to
cas.
this
On
question, which
interprète
means we
chacun,
interpret
chacune de
each
manière
case
différente.
differently, case by
C'est très
case,
bien cette réponse,
in,
mais je crois que
their
c'est insuffisant.
singularities.
Et il
That's a good
m'importe
answer, but it's not
de faire
sufficient.
comprendre aujourd'hui
It is important to me
qu'on
to make
ne
it clear
pratique pas les mêmes
that
formes et
we
formats
do not
d'interprétation
practice
à
the
l'époque de
same forms
Freud,
of
au
interpretation
temps de Lacan,
as
à
happened
l'époque
in
actuelle.
Freud's
Je
time
crois que
and Lacan's time.
les manières
And
d'interpréter
today, I think
varient
the
au cours de
interpretation
l'histoire de
and
psychanalyse.
ways of
Et je pense que
interpretation
c'est
vary
fondamental
throughout
de
history of
continuer à
psychoanalysis.
laisser
I think
varier
it's
les interprétations.
fundamental for them to
Prenons
continue
l'exemple, pensons
varying
à Mélanie
and
Klein.
changing.
Mélanie Klein, elle
Let's think
interprétait
about
les enfants
Melanie
qu'elle
Klein,
écoutait.
for example.
Et
She
bon, je
interpreted the
caricaturais un petit
children
peu,
she
mais
listened
pas
to.
tant que ça.
With
Tous les
her,
jeux
well,
d'enfants, tous les dires d'enfants que Mélanie Klein, que ce soit sur
so
le dessin ou dans les
all
jouets
the
avec lesquels elle
children's
s'amusait avec
games,
elle, ils
everything they
étaient
said,
édipalisés.
every little drawing they
L'interprétation, c'est toujours du
made,
type, ah, la petite
everything
voiture,
she
c'est papa. Je
Oedipalized.
rentre la
The
voiture dans le
interpretation was
garage, je sors le
always
garage, c'est
Oedipal.
forcément maman.
Oh,
Bon, là, dans l'interprétation,
the
oui,
car
c'est
is
ça.
entering the garage, so
Dans
the
un
garage
autre
is
temps,
necessarily mommy.
prenons
Well,
l'époque du triomphe de l'interprétation
it's worth what it's
simultane
worth, huh? I don't
lacanienne,
know.
époque
And in another
sans
vein, if you
doute
think back to
glorieuse,
the
où on
heyday
coupait
of
les séances
Lacanian
sur
meaningful
une minute de
interpretation,
temps
when
au bout de 3
sessions were
minutes,
cut
comme faisait le
short
maître de la rue de Lille, Jacques Lacan. Bon, à cette époque-là,
with
la séance,
after 3
elle n'était pas à
minutes
durée variable.
of
La séance,
session,
elle était
they were
pour
cut
tout le monde.
short based
5
on
minutes, boum.
meaningful
L'analysant
homophonies.
disait, par exemple,
So it
ah, tiens,
wasn't
demain, je dirai,
variable
boum,
sessions, they were short
fin de
sessions.
séance, coupure
The
de séance.
analyst would say,
L'analyste disait,
for
Fabrice
example, I'm
Bourlez,
going
ah,
to
la
see,
mère, vous
and
allez
then the
chez votre
analyst would
mère,
cut in
boum,
and say, oh,
60
you're
euros,
going to
500 francs français,
Amma, which is
coupure de la
in
séance.
French means mother. You're
Interprétation.
going to the mother.
Dans
Okay,
un cas
boom,
comme
end
dans
of session,
l'autre,
50
je ne pense pas
euros.
qu'on puisse encore
Well, in
interpréter
either
comme
case,
ça
I don't think we
aujourd'hui.
interpret like
Et
that
je crois que c'est
anymore.
important de
I
saisir
think
que
it's
la
important
manière dont on
to
interprète,
understand
c'est-à-dire
that the
la
way you
manière
handle
de couper, une partie de tout
interpretation
dans le discours de l'analysant. Hein.
or the way
L'interprétation,
you cut
c'est
and
souvent une
stitch
coupure
the
d'une coupure
analysant's
dans ce que vous dit la
discourse,
personne que vous écoutez.
the way
Eh bien,
you point
la
something out
manière
to
de
them in their
m'indiquer quelque
history,
chose dans son histoire,
and
dans ce qu'il ou elle vous raconte,
the way you
et le
point out
mieux qu'il
something
peut
in what
entendre.
they
Hein.
tell
C'est ça
you and they don't want
le
to
jeu d'un
hear,
analysant ou d'une analysante, c'est qu'il raconte des
the
choses
way you
qui
point out to
sont
them that
le point essentiel de ce
there's
qu'ils veulent
something
entendre.
new
Donc,
or
c'est
a
la
repetition that
manière
is emerging.
de pointer l'invivable,
Well, the way that you
la
point
manière de
out the
pointer quelque chose
unsayable to them,
d'inédit ou une
the
répétition
way
qui se
that
fait
you
jour dans le
point out
discours de quelqu'un,
something,
eh bien, cela
the
va
repetition that
varier
emerges
votre
in their
manière de
discourse,
pointer
well,
l'inédit, votre
all of
manière
this will
de
vary
pointer l'insupportable, de
not
pointer
only
l'inévitable. Ça
depending
va
on
varier
the
en fonction du
case,
cas que vous écoutez,
but
bien sûr,
also
mais ça va
depending
aussi
on the
toujours
theory you
varier
have in
en
mind.
fonction de la
So it doesn't
théorie
vary
de la
just in terms of the
métapsychologie
case,
que
but
vous
it
avez en tête.
varies in terms of the
Vous
metapsychology that
voyez
you have in
comment
mind.
ici, métapsychologie
So you
et
see
technique
how meta
C'est de se
psychology
revoir,
and technique are
lier,
connected, right?
C'est-à-dire que le Clénien qui dit ah papa c'est la
So
voiture,
the
maman c'est le garage,
Kleinian
on va plus le
who
comme ça.
firmly believes in the Oedipus
ça.
complex
Tout comme la
and that the
lacanienne
car
qui
is
toute
the
la
dad
scène
and the
de
garage is the mom,
qui vous dit ah la mère,
just as Lacanian is
reconnaissance,
convinced that
boum,
behind what we
et elle est
hear, behind
convaincue que
what is
derrière
said,
ce qui s'entend pour le diable
behind
qui
what is
attend en
said,
interdit,
there is the
derrière ce qui s'énonce, il y a
saying
de
of the
vie sur le
subject
sujet
of
de
the
la pensée, et que ce
unconscious,
dire ne surgit que grâce à l'équivoque
and
signifiant
that this
parfois.
saying only arises thanks to
Et je crois pas que ce soit
meaningful
intéressant de dire, oh
ambiguity.
là là, comme c'est ringard,
So I
Mélanie
don't think
Klein,
it's
ou là
interesting
là, comme
just
c'est
to
génial,
criticize
d'accord.
Melanie Klein and
Quand
say, oh, how
ces choses
corny she
fleurettent,
is, or
et de
how
manière beaucoup
brilliant
plus complexe,
Lacan is.
je crois
I
que
think we
tout
have
dépend
to
toujours de
analyze
comment
things in a more complex
on lit
manner.
les textes
It always
et de comment
depends
on
on how
utilise
you
les
read
théories,
and
qu'elles soient
how
lacaniennes,
we
kleiniennes ou autres.
use both
On peut être
Klein or
brillant
Lacan,
analyste kleinien
any
à
other
partir du moment où on
theoretician.
arrive
You
dans
can
une
be a
syntaxe
brilliant Kleinian
d'interprétation
analyst
oedipicienne.
if you can
Et qu'on peut être une
tactfully
parfaite
handle
imbécile
Oedipal
lacanienne
interpretation,
si on impose
and you can be a
systématiquement une
complete
pensée
Lacanian
de point de
idiot
vue
if you
à prescription
systematically
systématique.
impose short sessions on all your
Moi, je dirais
patients.
de manière beaucoup plus modeste et en reprenant des choses que j'ai
So,
déjà écrites par ailleurs,
very
que
modestly
l'interprétation, c'est
and
le temps et le
mentioning
lieu
things I have written
exact.
already,
Hein.
is that
S'autoriser
interpretation is the
à
time and
pointer
place for
quelque
psychoanalytic
chose
tact.
à quelqu'un,
To allow
ou
yourself to
il
point something
s'agit de
out to
trouver
someone,
le bon moment et la
you
bonne
have to
distance
find the right
pour
moment
pointer, pour
and the
indiquer
right
que de ce
distance
côté-là,
to
à ce moment-là,
indicate to
il y a
them
peut-être
that
quelque chose d'un
something
peu
may be
inédit
happening
qui
for them
surgit
on that
dans
side
le cas.
at that moment, something
J'ai l'habitude
unprecedented
de dire que
to
cette
the
interprétation
analysand.
psychanalytique, elle est
I often say that
tactique, c'est évidemment tact.
psychoanalytic interpretation is
L'interprétation
tactical.
tactique, c'est quoi? C'est
Tactical
l'envers de la stratégie.
interpretation, what is
Ah,
it?
qu'est-ce que c'est la stratégie?
It's
C'est
the opposite
ben,
of
la stratégie,
strategy.
c'est ce qui recense les
Strategy,
grands
what is
groupes.
strategy? It
C'est ce qui
governs
gère tout le monde de la
large
même manière.
groups.
Tandis que la
It
tactique,
treats everyone the
elle va
same
faire du cas
way,
par cas et elle va être
while
théorique.
tactics, on the other
La
hand, is
tactique,
full
elle
of
doit
tact
parvenir
and
à
it's
se
case by
réinventer
case.
à chaque fois, pour chaque
Tactics
histoire,
must
à chaque
be
session.
reinvented each
Et donc,
time for each story, for each
interpréter en
session.
psychanalyse,
So
c'est mettre en
interpreting in
place une
psychoanalysis
tactique de
means
lecture,
putting
qui est
in
l'inverse
place
exact de
a
la stratégie.
tactic of reading, and
Impossible
this is
d'avoir un
the
recours systématique
opposite of
à la
strategy.
stratégie
It is
du
impossible
complot-fétide,
to
qui voudrait
systematically
pour
resort
tous
to the
donner la même
Oedipus
façon.
complex strategy, which
Impossible
would
d'avoir
apply to everyone
recours
in
à
the
la
same way.
stratégie de la coupure sur
And it's also
l'homophone
impossible
signifiante,
to
qui
resort to
voudrait
the
pour tout le
strategy of the
monde de
cutting
la même
off,
façon.
to the strategy of cutting
Cette
off
piste
the
de
signifying
l'interprétation
homophony,
juste,
which would apply to
en
everyone
fait,
in the same way.
c'est
In fact, the
l'envers
tactic of
de
correct
l'interprétation
interpretation is
triomphante qui
the
fonctionne de la même manière
opposite
pour
of
tout le monde, qui est
triumphant,
puissante, qui est
all-powerful
porteuse de vérité,
interpretation
qui
that carries
éclaire
truth,
la vérité du
that works
sujet
the
à
same
partir
way
de
for
l'Oedipe ou à partir du
everyone,
cynique.
and
L'interprétation
and
juste,
clarifies
c'est
everything
un type
about the
d'interprétation
subject based on the
qui est plus
Oedipal or the
modeste.
signified.
Moi, je dirais que l'interprétation
This kind
juste,
of
c'est celle qui tombe
interpretation is a
exactement.
much more
Un petit peu comme si
modest
cette
type of
interprétation,
interpretation.
c'était une
Precise
flèche qu'on envoyait à
interpretation
chaque
is
fois.
the one that
Et ces
falls
flèches,
just
elles ne doivent
beside.
jamais
It's like
viser
an
le cœur
arrow
du
that
sujet
we're
concerné,
sending through the
mais elle
air,
doit plutôt
and it must
se
never
hisser
aim at the
jusqu'à lui. Elle
heart
doit
of the
plutôt
subject.
l'effleurer.
It just has to
L'interprétation
graze
juste,
it,
elle
graze
va
it lightly.
tomber
The
juste
right
à côté
interpretation falls
de ce
just
qui est
beside
ingérable
what
pour le
is
sujet.
unbearable for the subject.
Et le sujet pourra
And
s'emparer
then the
ou pas
subject can seize
de
the
la flèche.
arrow or not.
Pourra s'emparer ou pas de la flèche pour la lancer un petit peu plus loin. Alors, ce que j'essaye de vous dire ici, ça a l'air
And
très
then they can
concret,
throw it a bit
mais
further
ça
or not.
pourrait aussi être
What I'm
vu
trying to
comme
say
un
here seems very
enjeu
concrete, but it can
psychologique
also be seen
assez
as a
important.
fairly important
Je fais une petite parenthèse
meta-psychological issue.
théorique. Pour
So
celles et
I'm
ceux
going
qui
to make a
sont
little
lecteurs ou
theoretical
lectrices
digression for those who read not
de
only
Freud et
Freud and
Lacan,
Lacan, but
mais
also
aussi pour les
Derrida,
lecteurs et les
Jacques
lectrices de Jacques
Derrida,
Derrida et peut-être de quelques textes féministes.
and
Et pour celles et ceux
perhaps
qui ne lisent pas
also for
Derrida ni
readers
les textes
of
féministes, c'est pas grave,
feminist
ça vous donnera
texts.
peut-être envie de ramasser la flèche de Derrida et des textes
For
féministes
those
pour
who are not
continuer à avancer en
familiar with
psychanalyse.
Derrida and feminist texts,
Je crois que s'il y a un défi
perhaps it's the
théorique
time
pour la
for you
psychanalyse
to grab
contemporaine,
the arrow of
c'est
Derrida
de ne
and
pas
feminists
tomber
and give
dans l'écueil qui
and
est au fond
continue
commun
and give sequence
aussi
to it.
bien
I think that we cannot fall into the trap of the Freudian Kleinian interpretation, because sometimes this interpretation becomes systematic, and it's a trap. And what is this interpretation? If you carry out a super interpretation beside or if you under or over interpret, both in one case or another, Freudian or Kleinian, you are still inscribed in the same register. And Derrida, who was a French philosopher, he called this phallogocentric. It's an amalgama that he creates with phallus, logo, and centric. And when he says phallogocentric or phallogocentrism, he is able to encapsulate a real limitation of all Western thought. So what does Derrida says? He says that Western thought is the history of logos. What is logos? It's reason, truth, language in Greek. And this logos is the domain of men, according to Derrida. And Western thought and the metaphysics of Plato, of Descartes, Kant, and Freud and Lacan, it's the history of men. The history of thought is the history of the representation of truth. And Derrida shows how speech and the phallus bear witness to a particularly fruitful union in the field of psychoanalysis. So all these thinkers, Plato, Descartes, Kant, there's only men, all men. And he shows again how the phallus and speech bear witness to this fruitful union in Western metaphysics, or in other words, psychoanalysis. And Lacan did not hesitate to title one of his most important, The Meaning of the Phallus. And he has the intention of showing how meaning always depends on the phallus. And well before Lacan, Freud said he had structured all sexuality based on the importance given to the phallus. So therefore, we have the justified criticism and reservations of feminists towards psychoanalysis. Feminists say to psychoanalysts, but do you really believe that we must start with the phallus to explain female sexuality and to explain meaning or significance in general? No, of course not. No, that's what feminists are saying. In this amalgama of a word, phallogocentrism, everything is important. Not just phallus and logo. We also have to think about the word, the suffix centrism. We have the tendency, Derrida tells us, we have the tendency of thinking things from the center. And this is something very interesting, because often when we think about the openings of some contemporary psychoanalysis, they say they are inclusive, that they welcome minorities, LGBTQIA plus minorities. That's great. It's great to be inclusive. But what Derrida is showing in phallogocentrism is that there's a limit in inclusivity, and that the limit is that it integrates the margins into the center. And so the center remains in the center, and we don't change anything in the functioning of the system of thoughts. The tactic of reading text, as Derrida's practice as a philosopher, is the practice of deconstruction. What is deconstruction? It means reading the text not from the center, but from the margins. And why are we interested in the margins? Why is it interesting to reread text from the margins? It shows that the center in reality is only a repeated perceptual illusion. The center is an illusionary phenomenon. And if we read from the margins, we decentralize our practice and we decentralize theory. And said in another way, we could very well think about interpretation and sexuality, asexual and sexualities, meaning outside of the phallus and outside of the word present in itself. So Derrida advises us to favor writing over speech when we study the unconscious. This is interesting because we're talking about the talking cure, which is psychoanalysis. Derrida says let's focus on what leaves a trace, what leaves a wake, that which marks, rather than solely on the logic of phallocentric speech. I told you this was a very theoretical parenthesis, but it's also very concrete. It involves, what does this parenthesis mean about Derrida? It involves asking ourselves, what in the life story we hear during an analysis has become inscribed, written on the body of the person who is speaking in the way that they experience their own body. So what has been written? Derrida gives us an important clue. He says that we need to shift our way of thinking about the world and clinical practice away from the phallus as an image or representation of the male organ. And we have to move toward the phallus's role in structuring logos, the use of language, our unconscious grammar, and perhaps most importantly, how it structures our gaze. So think about what film theorist Laura Mulvey called the male gaze. It's a criticism of the gaze because the phallus is triumphant and it is always visible. So if you don't have the phallus, since Freud, you'd be relegated to the dark continent as a woman. So I think it's politically important for me to demonstrate that clinical practice does not necessarily have to revolve around the center polarized by the link between speech and the phallus. Otherwise, we risk relegating to silence, to the unspeakable, to the inexpressible, that which belongs to this so-called dark continent, that which does not impose itself within the all-powerful clarity of the enunciable. We risk making our listening systematic and deaf to what escapes the straight line of meaning, narration, and identity. What interested Freud at the outset was that which was not clearly stated, which was invisible. But you understand that here, I'm almost finishing, okay? So we are slipping here, we're slipping a bit. We are gradually moving from a technical question, how we interpret, to meta-psychological theoretical question. So how to think about clinical practice and interpretation alongside phallogocentrism. And my tentative answer today has been to try something on the side of tact. So I'm just recapping what we've said so far. And in tact, you have the word touch and not the gaze, which is insistent. From a metapsychological point of view, getting rid of the reference to the phallus, it may also mean getting rid of the
ton
reference
travail
to
du côté
vision in order to think about our work
Parce qu'au
from
fond, en
the
psychanalyse,
perspective
on n'a
of
jamais une
tact and
représentation
touch,
claire
because
de
deep
ce
down
dont
in
on parle.
psychoanalysis, we
Psychanalyse, on se
never
dit,
have a
on
clear
avance toujours en
representation
petite touche.
of what is
On avance
happening in
toujours
the
à
consultation
tâtons, en
room.
essayant de
We
toucher.
proceed by trial and
Mais
error
si on
and
comprend
small
les choses
steps,
de ce
small
côté-là,
touches.
vous vous
But you
apercevez bien qu'il n'y a pas
understand
seulement
that the
technique pour les
challenge,
métapsychologies. Pour
you
moi,
understand
c'est
that the
ce
challenge of
zoom-là,
thinking
l'endroit
about
vers
things in
lequel
this
on est
way
poussé,
is not only
c'est le toucher.
technical or
Je disais tout à l'heure,
metapsychological,
métapsychologie, technique et politique
there's also a
sont toujours
political
très
challenge
étroitement liées
here.
en psychanalyse.
And I
Ce qui
said
se passe dans cette
a little bit,
la
a little
manière
while
dont
ago,
on
that
pense, la
metapsychological
façon
technique
dont on
and politics are
et
always
surtout la
closely
façon
tied.
dont on pense
What
sur son
happens in the
identité,
consulting room, the way
ça ne se
we
situe pas uniquement du
interpret,
côté
the
du
way we
privé. Ça
listen
n'est
and
pas
think
quelque
about what
chose
we
de
have heard, it's not
intime
just
ou
private, it's not
il y a
just
un
something
enjeu
intimate or
profondément
individual.
politique à
There
travailler
is
avec
a profound
l'inconscient et le désir.
political issue at stake
Qu'est-ce que ça
in
veut dire?
working with the
Ça veut
unconscious
dire
and
vous répondre
desire.
est-ce que mon
What does this
travail
mean?
libère ou
It
est-ce qu'il est en
means
train
that we
de
have to ask
normer la
ourselves,
personne que je suis en train de
does my work
Est-ce que notre
liberate
manière
or does it
d'interpréter, elle dépend d'une
normalize?
conception, de
Does my
représentation,
way
de
of
modèle
interpreting
théorique, d'une
liberate,
doctrine a
or does it
priori
depend
qui
on
sont a priori
conceptions,
sourds à quel
representations,
type d'amour,
theoretical
quel type de
models that are
désir, quel type de
oppressive
famille,
a
quel type
priori,
d'injustice,
that
ou
are
est-ce qu'au
a
contraire,
priori deaf to this or that
notre
type of
manière
love or
d'interpréter
desire?
est en connexion avec les minorités?
Or is our way of
Soit le défi de
interpreting
la
in
psychanalyse
connection with
contemporaine,
minorities?
d'un point de vue
The
politique,
challenge of contemporary
c'est ma manière
psychoanalysis from a
d'envisager
political point of
mon
view,
travail
this is my
de
way
lisant
of
Derrida,
considering my work.
ce serait vraiment de
Reading the Hida would be
sortir le travail avec l'inconscient, la lecture, l'interprétation de nos
take
rêves,
the
nos
work
actes
with the
manqués, nos
unconscious,
symptômes,
reading
nos
and
fantasmes,
interpretation
en
of
dehors
dreams,
de la
our slips,
phallocentrisme.
our symptoms, our
Ce serait
fantasies, and take it
arriver
out
à
of
interpréter
phallocentrism.
en se méfiant
How can we
du
interpret
sens
while
qui
being wary of
tourne
the meaning that
autour de la
revolves
parole
around
en
speech
psychanalyse?
in
Ça, c'est
psychoanalysis?
une question et c'est une position qui est
It's an interesting
dérangeante, mais
question.
c'est intéressant
It's
de se
a
demander
position
est-ce
that is a
qu'on peut
bit
penser la thinking
uncomfortable,
cure
but it's
pure par la
interesting to
parole
ask
à
ourselves this.
côté de la référence au phallus?
Can we think
Qu'est-ce
of
que
the
ça
talking
donnerait?
cure
C'est une
alongside the
question dérangeante, mais
reference to
c'est une
the
question nécessaire.
phallus
Et
or
c'est une
outside
question
the
qui
reference of
vaut
the
la peine
phallus?
d'être posée
What
à
would that
l'heure
look like?
où nos désirs, notre
It's a question
sexualité,
that is
notre rencontre
necessary and that
amoureuse
is worth
sont
it.
tout autant
Our
déterminés
desire,
par
our
l'histoire personnelle
sexuality
que par
are
les algorithmes,
determined as much by our
par
personal
des
histories
machines.
as by algorithms,
Si vous
by
pensez à toutes les applications
machines.
de rencontres, à tous les sites qui
So
prennent en
I'm
charge
thinking of
les
all the
vies
dating
d'éros
apps,
aujourd'hui,
all the
eh bien,
websites that have
ce sont toujours
take charge of
beaucoup
our
plus
erotic
des machines
lives.
qui prennent en charge notre
There
éros
are much more
que
machines
juste
that
des mots.
occupy of our eros
Ici, la
than
référence en termes
just
d'éros,
words.
elle n'est plus tellement du côté
So
du
the
symbolique,
reference
du
in
côté des
terms of
mots,
eros
mais
is
du
not
côté de la
so much
performance et du
symbolic,
calcul.
but on
Voilà,
the
je crois
side
que le
of
défi de
performance,
l'interprétation
beside the
psychanalytique, c'est
calculation.
arriver
So thinking
à
about
faire face à ces
psychoanalysis
nouvelles manières de
is to be
configurer
before
l'existence.
and confronting
C'est
oneself with
arriver à
these
se dire
new
que,
ways
tiens,
of
les sujets qu'on
of
rencontre aujourd'hui,
configuring our
bien sûr qu'ils
jouissances.
ont encore affaire à un autre familial.
The
Bien
subject
sûr qu'ils
today
ont encore affaire à un autre
has to deal with the
relationnel, langagier.
familiar
Mais
other,
les sujets
the
qu'on rencontre
relational
aujourd'hui
other, the
ont
language other,
aussi
but the
affaire à
way
un
that we
autre et
find subjects
profondément,
today, they are
irrémédiablement
also
technologique.
dealing with the other
Et
that
je
is
crois que
irremediably
l'interprétation
technological.
psychanalytique
So I
peut
think
valoir
psychoanalytic
comme un acte de résistance
interpretation
contre la
is an
stratégie
act of
d'endormissement
resistance against the
généralisé des algorithmes.
strategy of
Que penser la
generalized
psychanalyse à
hypnosis of
côté de la référence
algorithms.
au
So to
phallus,
think about
en dehors
psychoanalysis
de sa
outside the reference of the
centralité,
phallus,
c'est
outside of its
passer de
centrality,
l'adhésion au tact et au toucher.
is to
C'est
go to
parvenir
the
à
tact and
subvertir
touch
ce qui
vision.
nous met à
We have to
distance pour
subvert
arriver à en faire une
what
force commune.
distance us
Et je crois
to
que
be
ça,
able to
c'est
carry
un
out a
enjeu
common
technique,
effort. And I
métapsychologique
think this
et
is a
politique.
technical,
Je crois que c'est
metapsychological,
l'un des
and
principaux
political
défis
issue.
pour que nous,
And I believe
comme
it is one of the main
psychanalytistes,
challenges
restions vivants et
for the
vivants aujourd'hui.
psychoanalytic
Je vous
discipline
remercie.
to remain alive today. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Fabrice. Bravo. A very rich offering to all of us. So many ideas that could have been unpacked for many more hours, I think. So thank you so much. Seems at the very least you've provoked us to think about how psychoanalysis itself must remain living if it is to support the staying alive, the becoming alive of subjects in the contemporary era. And I think the way you put into question many of the um, hidden assumptions embedded in our practice, the way you raise anew the fundamental questions, I think gives us a lot of avenues for resuscitating psychoanalysis for the 21st century. This is a time now for everyone to engage in dialogue. So feel free to raise a question. You have options. You can do so in the chat if you like. We'll be monitoring that. But also, if you want to speak your question, you can use the raise hand function. Might be the best option if you can find it. I think it's in that area that says react. We have a question already. Maro, would you like to begin? Go ahead.
Fabrice, bonjour. J'ai toujours merci pour votre conférence.
So
Premièrement,
thank you, Fabrice,
et,
for your conference today.
je suis toujours très inquiète avec ce terme politique. Et
I'm always
parmi
worried with the
votre
political.
lecture, je pense que ce politique
During your talk,
pleinement développé dépend fondamentalement de
I
l'analyse
think
de
that the
l'analyste.
political
Hmm.
depends
Pour
of
qu'il puisse écouter
the analysis of the
largement ses patients.
analyst, so that he can
Parce que ce terme politique
broadly
a
listen to
une
his patients,
équivoque
because this political
fondamentale
topic,
qui est la politique.
there's a
La politique
fundamental
dans la science,
error,
la politique comme
which
qui fait
is
part de l'analyse comme la métapsychologie et comme la clinique.
that is
Et c'est
part of
ça, c'est très
analysis, such as
général, mais ça
metapsychology
m'inquiète
and
vraiment
the clinic
comme
and
analyste.
technique.
Oui.
So it's something that really concerns me as an
Soyez pas
analyst.
inquiet. Merci pour votre question.
Don't worry.
Je pense que
Don't worry
d'un
about
côté, vous avez tout à fait
expressing
raison.
yourself
C'est-à-dire
precisely. I
que
think you are completely correct on one
la
side.
dimension d'ouverture et d'écoute
The dimension
que l'analyste
of being open to and
doit parvenir
listening
à mobiliser
that the analyst
dépend de sa
must
propre
be
analyse.
able to
Autrement dit, pour le dire beaucoup plus
mobilize.
simplement et
Of
avec le
course, it
temps,
depends on their own
l'analyste
analysis,
doit
and
se
putting it
défaire par son
more
analyse
simply,
de la somme de
the
ses préjugés.
analysts must let
Donc,
go of the
effectivement,
sum of their
une analyse,
prejudice.
ça aide à être un tout
So
petit peu moins
effectively, an
embrouillé
analysis
de soi-même et par soi-même. On n'est pas
helps
là quand on
one
est en
to
position
be
d'analyse
less
pour raconter son
involved in
histoire, on est là
oneself.
pour
We
écouter
are
l'histoire
not
de l'autre.
there as an
Donc,
analyst to
effectivement,
tell
de ce
our
point de
own
vue-là,
story.
il y
We're
a
there
des
to
tâches
listen to
roses
somebody
qui nous
else's story.
extraient
So
de
from
nos
this point of
préjugés
view, there is
personnels,
something that
d'identité, nos préjugés familiaux et donc
undoes
aussi
our
nos préjugés
individual
politiques.
prejudice, our family,
Une autre manière de dire
political,
ce que vous avez
etc.
dit, c'est que,
prejudices.
au fond,
So
quand il y a
another
du
way of saying what you
contre-transfert
said
dans la
is
cure,
that deep down, when there
c'est-à-dire
is
qu'il y a un truc trop
countertransference in treatment,
violent,
when
ou
we
qu'un patient nous
experiment
énerve trop,
something
que sais-je,
violent
peut-être que
with
c'est
the
le moment de
analysand,
reculer, vous allonger,
the
de
analysand
retourner
upsets
voir
you or
quelqu'un pour superviser,
irritates
parce
you,
que
then it's
effectivement,
worth going back to
ça
your
emportera
analysis or
et que
going to
donc
supervision,
c'est plus la
because this takes up a lot of
question, et c'est
room.
vous, c'est votre personnalité qui est en question.
And it's not the patient in
Ça, je
question
suis d'accord
anymore,
avec
it's
vous.
you and your
Une
personality.
analyse
Yes, I agree
sert à
with
devenir un
that.
tout petit peu moins con, et ça
Analysis
sert surtout à se
helps you
déprendre
to
de soi-même.
become a little bit less
Maintenant,
idiotic and to
attention,
get rid of your
je
own
crois
self.
que
So, but
dans
attention
la
here.
métapsychologie,
in metapsychology, in the way that we think the unconscious drive of thinking, how the unconscious chains are structured in our relationship with language, our metapsychological reflections. They are political stances. And it's not just, a way of thinking about language or desire, but it's also in how you sometimes forget some types of drive or desire, some types of lives that psychoanalysts, that's where it turns into something political. The work that I'm trying to develop when I try to think and say that technique, metapsychology, and politics are connected, I'm trying to undo the idea of the benevolent neutrality of the analyst. And there's a feminist psychoanalyst from Belgium. I'm going to write her name in the chat. She said that speaking is never neutral. That's one of the title of her books. Speaking is never neutral, and being silent is never neutral. So we have to reflect how we make silence in treatment, and how we talk in treatment, and how we, and what, before what, and before what we are silent, and before what we talk. So the political side, we have to undo our prejudices. It's an intimate and personal matter, but the sum of our prejudice is also a theoretical and social issue. I'm always divided between two loves. I have Lacan on one side, and on the other side, I have the Deleuze and Guattari's desiring machine. We can see how the unconscious, they are desiring and political machines. There is no neutrality in the field of the unconscious. There is a political side, there's a revolutionary side, there's a subversive side.
Thank you very much for that. Fabrice, there's a question in the chat about your book and whether it is translated in Portuguese. Maybe you could speak a bit about your publications for those who would like to read your work.
Non. Avis aux amateurs, avis aux maisons d'édition. Le Tact n'est pas encore traduit en portugais. Allez-y, les
My
amis.
book is not translated in Portuguese yet into Portuguese. So where are the publishing houses? Let's make this happen.
It begins now. Let's let the word reverberate out to the
Exactly.
to the Portuguese publication possible avenues. Does anyone else have a question?
Let's spread the thing.
Yes, spread the word.
Just to remember that the queer psychanalyse n'est pas traduit aussi, hein, en portugais.
On a de l'espoir pour Queer Psychanalyse. N'est-ce pas, Fernanda?
While others are gathering their questions, maybe I'd like to pose something, if you don't mind, Fabrice. I loved your remarks about interpretation, and I think they are right to the heart of the matter. But I have a question that's been sort of plaguing me for a while, is if the concept of interpretation is one of those instances where we run into a certain limit in re-signifying an old traditional word, and if we need to invent new signifiers for this more tact-based intervention. I've not yet been satisfied with the words I've been experimenting with, but I wonder if you think there's something in the concept of, or the concepts that are suggested by the term interpretation, laden as it is with the history that it has, that might represent a bit of a cage sometimes. I don't know. What do you think?
Oui, absolument. Je suis tout à fait d'accord. L'interprétation
Yes, for sure.
peut devenir une boîte
Interpretation
qui enferme.
can
Et
become a
tout le
box that
travail,
closes.
c'est de faire en sorte
And
que l'interprétation
the
reste
work
vivante.
is to make it so that interpretation remains alive.
Ce sera, Dorothée me disait de faire un peu un teasing sur le cours
Dorothée
philosophies
was telling
que je
me
donnerai
to
dans le cadre de l'IIP.
give a teaser
C'est véritablement
about
la
the
question qui,
post-human
dans
jouissance
me
that I'm
semble
going to teach
la
at the
plus
IIP. I
marquante,
think that
la plus
something that is very
urgente.
striking in
Je
clinical practice
m'aperçois
and that is most
que très souvent,
urgent.
les gens que je
I
rencontre
notice that
sont
often the people that
autant marqués par le
I
signifiant, par
meet
l'histoire familiale,
are
etc.,
so
mais
marked by the
que
signifier,
la
by the
jouissance,
family history.
ce qui les encombre le plus, ce qui revient le plus toujours à la même place aujourd'hui, n'est pas seulement quelque chose de
But
l'ordre
those who
de
most return to the same place, it's not just
quelque chose
a
qui
matter
tenait en
of
nous.
order, it's
Mais j'ai
it's
vraiment
something
l'impression
that
que l'analyste
not
aujourd'hui,
just
il est
something that put
confronté de
itself in
manière
word. I
très
think that the analyst
tangible et
today
directe à
is
des substances
confronted
qui
in a
sont des substances
very
synthétiques, des substances de
direct
drogue de
way
synthèse.
to
Je pense à des
substance.
addictions aux
For
écrans,
example,
et qui
drugs,
sont
synthetic
des choses qui
substances,
sont vis-à-vis
addiction to
desquelles des
screens,
dimensions de rapport au
things
corps
that
justement, où
dimensions,
l'interprétation
relationships with the
langagière
body,
classique
where
elle peine
classic
un tout petit
language
peu à
interpretation,
avoir une prise, en fait.
it has
Je me dis qu'il
difficulties
s'agit vraiment
to
de ne pas
have a
s'enfermer
certain
dans la
strength of
manière
force.
d'interpréter
So
à la
we
façon,
cannot
j'ai envie de dire.
close off
On
close
a eu
ourselves
comme
off
ça
in a way
d'abord
of
l'interprétation
interpreting
freudienne, c'était
things like
inventé,
mommy,
nous sommes
daddy,
conscients.
etc.
Très bien.
We had
Ah,
Freudian
je n'arrive pas à
interpretation
parler,
who
mais bien
added
sûr
that
que
added
votre
meaning
mère,
to
dans votre
meaning.
cas,
Okay,
elle vous avait donné des
but
fraises
I
quand vous
can't
aviez
put it any
3
more
ans et vous n'en
clearly.
aviez pas
It's
envie, et du coup, vous
your
vouliez,
mommy
etc.
who gave you a strawberry when you were
L'interprétation
8 and you
mérinologue
didn't
qui
want
rajoute
it,
du
so
sens au
you don't
sens, bon,
you don't like
ça peut
strawberries
marcher, je dis
anymore,
pas que ça marche toujours,
etc.
mais c'est une manière
It's a
d'interpréter qui, après
hermeneutic
Lacan, n'est plus tout
interpretation
à
that adds
fait
meaning to meaning.
satisfaisante.
And then Lacan
Effectivement, quand Lacan nous
is
dit
not
l'interprétation
satisfied with this
passe par la
anymore. When
couture et
Lacan says that
l'écriture, c'est beaucoup
interpretation
plus intéressant.
goes
Quand
through
l'interprétation
cut and
vise
sewing, it's much
le
more
réel
interesting.
de
And when
chaque sujet, le point
interpretation
intouchable, la chose
aims at the real of each
qui
subject
évidemment lui rend la vie la plus
to
invivable,
touch
ça ne
that
passe pas forcément
makes your
par quelque
life
chose
more
de l'ordre d'un
unbearable,
sens
it doesn't
accompli, ça ne
involve
passe pas
something of the
forcément
order of
du
meaning.
côté d'un sens qui fait unité, comme on pouvait l'avoir du côté de l'interprétation imaginaire. Ça va être plutôt une
It's no longer a
interprétation
meaning
qui
that
est
creates
plutôt
a
symbolique et
unity.
qui vise le
It's
réel.
something
C'est une
that
interprétation qui va pouvoir être
is a
couture, un
symbolic
bordorée,
interpretation
quelque
that
chose
aims
qui
towards
vient
the real, where
interrompre le
you can have
discours
a
au bout de
cut,
5 minutes,
something that interrupts
une surprise
discourse
dans le discours,
in
un
5 minutes, a
espacement dans le
surprise in
récit. Voilà, c'est un
discourse.
espacement dans le récit de la
It's a
personne qui est en train de parler.
spacing
On
in the
essaie d'avoir
narrative of
l'interprétation
the
comme un
person who
espace.
is
Bon,
speaking.
formidable. Le
We
fait
try
est que j'ai
to
l'impression
put
que même
interpretation as
ce
a sort of
type
spacing.
d'interprétation-là
So
risque de devenir
even
une
this type of
rétinière, en fait, de
interpretation that
devenir
I'm
un
talking
robot,
about,
si pratiqué avec trop de certitude, avec trop d'habitude,
it can
et si
also turn
confronté
into a blah
à
blah
de
blah,
types,
something
des
very
modalités de
repetitive
jouissance
if it's treated
qui, au
with
fond,
this
sont un petit
habit
peu
when you're confronted with types of
différents de
jouissance that
la
are
jouissance
uh,
provoquée par l'inscription
re-
langagière. C'est-à-dire que
they
les
refer
machines,
to the
j'ai
jouissance
l'impression qu'elles ont
of
un effet
excessive
sur mon corps
verbalization. So
qui
machines have a
nécessite
effect on our
un
body. I
autre
have the
type
impression that
d'interprétation qui reste à inventer. J'ai
that
absolument
require a
aucune
different
recette à
type of
côté, mais moi,
interpretation
c'est ce
that we
qui
have to
m'intéresse
invent.
aujourd'hui. C'est-à-dire,
There is no
comment est-ce qu'on
recipe,
sort de
but
l'interprétation
it's what interests
déterminée?
me in
Comment est-ce
thinking
qu'on
about
sort
today.
d'une
How do we
conception du
leave
cercle
the
herméneutique? Comment est-ce qu'on
hermeneutical
pratique une
interpretation?
interprétation
How do we
qui
leave
ouvre
this
l'expérience du
circle that is
sujet à un
closed
peu plus
and
de
then
vie?
we open the subject's experience to have a little bit more life?
Thank you very much. Doro, do you want to handle some of these questions in the chat?
Sim, a gente tinha uma pergunta no chat, mas a pessoa acabou de falar que já
We
foi
had a
respondida.
question in the chat, but the person said that it has just been answered, so that's that.
Tem outro
How's
comentário
that for tact?
sobre o do Josué.
We have
Tá
another
falando,
comment by
"Obrigado,
Josué.
Fabrice.
He's
Eu
saying,
penso
thank
aqui
you,
sobre essa
Fabrice.
posição do
I
tato
think
sobre
about this
superfície.
position of the
Alguém que
tact
nunca
on a
se dá sobre
surface,
algo plano,
something
mas
that
sobre essa
never,
superfície bem singular.
something that takes place on a very singular surface. We would have tact on this surface.
Surface bien singulière, surface que de manière, voilà, lacanienne, ou de
If
manière
we
très
do it
féministe aussi, avec quelqu'un comme
in a very
Anne
feminist or Lacanian way.
Sterling, surface singulière, étonnante, que Lacan, comme la féministe biologiste Anne Foster Sterling, appelle la bande de Mébius.
It's surprising.
Que, bien sûr, on est sur une surface où
the surface is taken into the Mobius strip by Lacan, where exterior and interior are no longer opposed, but we go through inside and outside nonstop, walking on this strip that is twisted. So I think that effectively interpretation, it serves to twist in a different way. It's in the place, in the passage, and when the subject goes from the inside to the outside. I think this model of the Mobius strip that Lacan uses in seminar anxiety, and he also uses it to express relationships between nature and culture, and how our bodies is always composed of cultural and natural elements. And what is useful to think about this band is that it is elastic, it can stretch. A person is never a fixed point, they're always in movement. It's a twist that gives a bit more of elasticity that we have in treatment and to the analysis that we're listening to in the office. Any other question? We have one more in the chat. I'm going to read it.
Fabrice
mentioned criticism to phallocentrism in psychoanalysis. In light of this, I'd like to hear your opinion about the challenges when they defend that the analyst is someone who does not have a gender. I think this neutrality ends up erasing the differences in masculinity in its different formats. How can we think about analytical practice that is contemporary without falling into phallocentrism and the illusion of neutrality?
Oui, ça c'est vraiment une question fondamentale. Merci de la poser. C'est la question.
So this is an essential issue. Thank you for asking. So we have to think about analysis as a situated practice. What does this mean, a situated practice? It doesn't mean that it's a practice where the analyst has to say exactly who they are. I'm a man, I'm a homosexual, so I'm situating myself in this place, in the social chessboard. The situated practice, you have to think about this on the side of leaving neutrality. Leaving neutrality means that you have an analysis, for example, a Black analyst for Black people, a lesbian analyst for lesbians, etc. That doesn't make sense either. That has nothing to do with a situated psychoanalysis. Situated psychoanalysis is a psychoanalysis that can situate its concepts. What does that mean, to situate concepts? that
parce que c'est quoi le
here
problème du
we
phallogocentrisme?
go
C'est qu'il se
back
remet
to
jamais
the
en question.
criticism to phallogocentrism. What the issue is that they never question themselves. To say that our interpretations, our concepts, our metapsychology, and our way of practicing technique, to say all of this is situated, what does this mean? It means that psychoanalysis is always inscribed in a certain time and a certain place, and the concepts as well. So that means that the universal does not have much to do with psychoanalysis. So jouissance has a different declination depending on the time we are living in. So deep down, the concepts have a history. Concepts must always be retaken, reanalyzed in a plastic, malleable way. So situated psychoanalysis is when we stop situating ourselves, we think that things are universal, and then we become more and more oppressive, because that means this is valid for everybody. And the inverse is also true, because Freud proposed this. He says that we must interest ourselves in the most singular. When we interest ourselves in the singular of each person, we have to situate our knowledge, our practice, our ways of doing and saying as a subject of the unconscious. So to say that the subject of the unconscious, it varies very clearly. The subject of the unconscious, as Lacan and Freud formulated it, perhaps we have to roll up our sleeves and keep developing ways to talk about the subject of the unconscious depending on the time we are living in. And I think it's important to situate your practice because we can make it so that differences can continue to emerge in the field of psychoanalysis. If you don't situate your practice, if you think your practice is universal and unchangeable, then you are thinking based on the universal. Then I'm thinking about the criticism that we receive. Oh, situating is not good because it's a narcissistic thing, or situating oneself is putting yourself too much in putting too much emphasis on yourself. Oh, I'm a lesbian, immigrant, analyst. No, that's not what we're talking about. Situating your practice is making differences emerge, differences in plural, making your concepts emerge so that you can say that there is no universal in this work. There are configurations, they are instances where we have to think about things. In the history of psychoanalysis, such concept was thought of like this, the concept of the phallus. Perhaps we can question it now. Perhaps it was central when Lacan wrote his seminars, but perhaps today it's not as necessary, or maybe we can use it in a different way. So to situate your thinking is to allow for the differences to emerge instead of just remaining on the register of the universal.
Thank you again. I think we have time for probably one, maybe two more questions. Does anyone else want to raise a question or bring a comment? Go ahead, please.
I can speak in Portuguese. Diante dessa pergunta que eu fiz ao Fabrice sobre
Considering the question that I asked Fabrice about this situated place of psychoanalysis, why did I ask it? In transmission, at least in Brazilian territory, I have noticed and have been noticing that there is a resistance of some analysts, especially men, in debating topics such as masculinity and talking about the place of the racialized subject, of talking about the place that has
E
sexuality as a
me
marker,
disse que
and
a gente precisa separar a
a
marca do
colleague
social
told me
de
that we need to
subjetividades.
separate global
Que
marker from
na clínica,
subjectivity.
na pesquisa,
In
o marcador social
research,
ele
a social
aparece
marker
como algo
is
que
something
precisa ser
that
falado e
needs
pontuado.
to be
Mas
talked
na
about
clínica, a
and
gente tem que tratar o
punctuated.
marcador
But in
social
clinical
como uma
practice, we need
subjetividade.
to
Contudo,
deal with this
tem
marker
um
as
ditado aqui no
subjectivity.
Brasil,
But there's a
especificamente
saying here in Brazil,
na
specifically
região onde eu moro,
in the
que diz
region where I
assim: se tem
live, which
lembrete
says
é porque tem
if there's a
história. E
reminder,
um
it's
lembrete
because
muito
there's a
claro que
history.
aparece na minha
And a
clínica
reminder
é:
that appears in
procuro
my
sempre
clinical
uma analista
practice,
negra porque não me
I
sinto à
look for a
vontade
Black
em ter
analyst
falado
because I
com
don't feel
analista tal e
comfortable
tal que é
talking
branca.
to white
Prefiro
analysts.
alguém
I
que
prefer
perpasse pela
somebody
temática do
who
LGBT,
is included
QIA+,
in the
porque não me sinto
LGBTQI
representada nem
plus plus
confortável em falar
topics
com
because I
alguém
do
que
not
não
feel represented
sabe
or
desse
comfortable
lugar. Não
talking to
necessariamente
somebody who is not in this place.
alguém
So
que
not
esteja
necessarily
imerso,
somebody who is
né, nessa
immersed
prática da vida,
in this
mas que de alguma
practice,
forma
but
possa me escutar.
somehow
A
can listen
verdadeira,
to
né,
me.
aquela, entre aspas, redoma da
So
escuta
it's
sem
this
julgamento. Eu tenho percebido
dome
que
of
tem havido
listening
julgamento
without
na escuta. Por se ter lembrete,
judging. And
tem
I see
história.
that there is a lot of
Eu
judging
parto de um
actually.
lugar
So
racializado e
I am in
onde
a
a raça,
racialized
as
place
etnias, o
where
gênero é muito
race, ethnicity, and
presente
gender
na
is very
clínica onde eu me
present in my
inscrevo.
clinical
Contudo, quando eu
practice.
olho para
However,
indivíduo, eu estou sempre olhando para a história. Não é
when I
como
look
você
at an
disse mesmo,
individual,
não é
I'm
minha
always
história
looking
que
at the
está sendo
history.
contada,
It's not
mas o que está
my
sendo,
story that's being
sendo
told,
posto é a minha escuta.
but
E
what
eu estou ali
is
para
being
entender a história
put
de quem
forth is my
chega até
listening,
mim.
and I'm
Mas
there to
geralmente essas
listen to
histórias
those who
chegam
come to
já
me.
marcadas
But these
pela dor de não terem
stories
sido
come to
ouvidas
me
em outro lugar.
marked by the pain of
Agradeço
not
pela
having
oportunidade.
been listened to in another place, another analyst.
Merci beaucoup de cette remarque, Ana Paula. C'est
Thank
exactement
you
ça. Et puis,
for
ce qu'il faut se
this
dire surtout, c'est que
comment, Ana Paula.
quand on est privilégié, on ne s'aperçoit
And
pas de
what
ses
we need to
privilèges.
say is that when we
On ne se
have
rend pas compte qu'on est
privileges,
privilégié
we
quand
do
on est
not
privilégié. Et on ne se rend pas compte non
perceive that
plus
we are
de la
privileged.
manière dont
And we also
plupart
don't
du temps,
realize
ces privilèges
we don't
oppressent
realize how these
d'autres personnes.
privileges
Et donc, effectivement, ce collègue qui vous
oppress
dit,
other
ah, mais dans la
people
clinique, il n'y
so
a pas de ça,
effectively. Your
parce qu'on
colleagues who
s'intéresse qu'au
said,
sujet, bon,
oh,
il
this
s'aperçoit
doesn't
peut-être pas
exist in
vraiment de
clinical
la
practice
manière
because
dont
we're
rien
only
que le
interested
fait
in the
de
subject.
penser la
Well,
clinique
they
comme
do not
ça, se
realize
dire,
that
ah, mais il y a d'un
this
côté
way
la
of
clinique et
thinking
puis de
about
l'autre
the
les questions
clinic,
sociales,
that
c'est une
there's
position
one
qui est
side, there's the
privilégiée,
clinic, and the
c'est une
other side,
position
there's
qui est extrêmement
historical and
oppressante.
social
Et
issues.
donc,
That's already a very
dire
privileged
que
place. That's
quelqu'un qui
quite
est
oppressive.
racisé, qui
So
a envie de parler de son propre rapport à la souffrance qu'il a
someone
pu,
who is
de la
racialized
manière
and wants
où
to talk
cette
about
souffrance a pu être rencontrée
their
dans son parcours de
own
vie par rapport à
relationship
des questions
with these
raciales,
issues
bah,
and how
il
their
est évident que cette
suffering
personne, elle
has
va peut-être se
taken
sentir
place
plus à l'aise avec
over
vous
the course of their
qu'avec
lives.
quelqu'un d'autre.
Of course, they're
Qu'est-ce qu'on
going to
veut
feel more
surtout dire
comfortable with you
essentiellement?
than with
On est en train
someone
de dire que
else.
voilà, le
So, what are we
transfert, c'est pas quelque chose
saying? We're
d'universel,
saying
que
that
le transfert,
transference
il
is
est
not
inscrit
universal.
socialement, politiquement.
Transference is
Le
inscribed
transfert, ce n'est pas
socially,
seulement quelque chose
politically.
d'intime
Transference is
entre
not just
moi et
something
mon
that happens
analyste, mais c'est
intimately
aussi quelque
between me
chose
and my
qui a besoin
analyst. It's
et
also
qui fonctionne
something that
par rapport à une
requires
discipline,
and that
en fait. Et
works
donc,
in
évidemment que
relationship
c'est
to a
fondamental qu'il y ait des
discipline.
analystes qui
So,
se
of course,
situent
it's
du point de
fundamental
vue
to
du
have
point de vue de la race, du
analysts
point
who
de vue des
situate themselves
minorités.
from the point of view of
Pourquoi? Pas
gender,
seulement
from
parce que,
ethnicity, from
ah
race,
ben
from
alors je me sens à
minorities,
l'aise avec toi, parce que
not
je pense
only
que tu as vécu la même oppression que moi. Non, mais
someone else will feel more
justement pour
comfortable with you
montrer
because
comment
you might have lived the same oppression
il n'y
as
a
I
pas
did,
la
but
psychanalyse, il n'y a pas
precisely to
l'universel de la
show
psychanalyse. Il y a
that
les
there
antipraticiens et il
isn't
y a une
the
diversité de praticiens et de
psychoanalysis, there isn't
praticiennes.
the
Et c'est
universal.
grâce à
There
ça
are
qu'un
people who
transfert
practice
par rapport à la
psychoanalysis, there's a
discipline
diversity of
peut advenir.
clinics,
Donc,
and thanks to
merci
this, the
pour votre remarque,
transference
évidemment.
can emerge. So thank you very much for your comment, of course.
Obrigada, thank
Thank
you.
you.
A bientôt.
Thank you for that rich dialogue, both of you. We are up against the clock, but do you think, Dorothea, would be okay if we receive this last question from Raj? It's in two parts, but it has to do with psychoanalysis in the global South. Maybe we go over one moment. First, they say, how can we make psychoanalysis answer the question of the global South countries like India, China, Nepal, and smaller countries? followed by psychoanalysis speaks of the unconscious and desire being structured by the other. In my life, caste has always acted as a brutal other, dictating my social worth and possibilities. How does psychoanalysis help understand the psychic effects of systemic caste oppression? And can it illuminate a path for a subject like me to assert desire and agency beyond these imposed structures?
Je demande juste une petite parenthèse.
Oui.
Je veux bien que tu répondes, Fabrice, mais on a nos traducteurs qui sont déjà pendant. As pessoas estão já. Desculpa,
Just
Fernanda.
a detail.
Nossas tradutoras já estão super agradecidas, mas já estão 1h30. Só bem curto, por favor, sua resposta.
So just a short answer, because our translators have been talking for an hour and a half and they need some well-deserved rest.
Absolument. Réponse très
All
courte, et
right.
puis on va manger nos frites.
So just a short
Comme j'ai l'habitude de dire.
answer.
Donc,
And later on, we
donc,
can
évidemment que c'est tout l'enjeu
go on to have our
de psychanalyse,
feijoada
c'est
in Brazil.
voir comment
So what is at play in psychoanalysis is to see how the structures that oppressed us, whether they be social, cultural, familiar, intimate, how they can be re-subjectified. You ask the $100 question of psychoanalysis: how do we deal with the other, of the family, of social, of the technological? We do not have a single answer. We have positions to work on this issue. We have to work on it.
Okay, thank you. Once again,
Time
Fabrice
for French
Bourlez,
fries.
thank you so much for this incredible dialogue, wonderful talk. This was so illuminating. Everyone, don't forget all the upcoming events. Tatiana Gomez next week. Don't forget to look into our formation programs, which are beginning very soon. And please join us at all the future IIP events you may like. You can always find us on social media and at the website. Thank you again, everyone, for participating, and have a lovely weekend.
Merci, au revoir.